Hello and welcome to today's PIR live event webinar brought to you by Partners in Research Canada. My name is Stacey Joyce and I will be your host. If you're joining us live, remember that you can ask questions anytime by clicking Q&A near the bottom of your screen. I will relay these questions to our guest a little later on. Please include your name, your school, or your city so that we can give you a shout out when we ask your question. We're joined today by Dr. Oyedeji Ayonrinde, sorry about that, Dr. Oyedeji Ayonrinde, and he is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, and he is also the medical director of heads up the Early Psychosis Intervention Program in Southeast Ontario. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you, Deji, and you can share your screen there, because we would love to hear what you have to say today on cannabis in Canada.
Great, good morning, and thank you for the invitation to present today. I hope you can see my screen. Thank you very much, and thanks for the really lovely introduction. Well, we're really in exciting times now regarding cannabis, and in a few weeks' time, Canada will be legalizing cannabis for recreational use. I work in Queen's University as introduced, and I'll start the presentation straight away. Now, there's so many words for cannabis. There's weed, pot, spliff, in the UK, skunk. And these are some words, but they're just ever so many. And when young people talk about cannabis or weed or marijuana or pot, these words are used as they communicate about it. Now, cannabis has been around for many years, and it's been available for medical use and recreational use as mentioned, and also available in what's known as the black market or gray market. And that means people are able to get cannabis for different reasons, from different sources. Medical use is gaining a lot more importance, and there's a lot of research being done around that. And that's really useful, but a lot more science needs to be done. So some members of your families may be on medical cannabis or medical marijuana for different sorts of health problems. And as I said, this has been around for a long time historically, for many, many years before it was banned and back again. So why legalize cannabis? Well, one, it's been around in the world and used very heavily for many years. And for a time, people used to get into trouble with the law, go to jail, and serve sentences for possession of cannabis. This had an impact on their family lives, their education, and that took a major toll. What the government realized is actually that cannabis being so available and with it being a criminal offense to use it, it wasn't really helping people as much. And furthermore, science and medicine had a lot more discovered, which changed opinion. So it's been legalized, and there'll be a lot of monitoring to go with that. So what is cannabis? Well, cannabis, as we know, is from the flowery tops of the female plant, not the male plants, the female plants. And it's got chemical compounds in it known as cannabinoids, the major ones being THC and CBD. You've probably heard of them. So they're the major ones. And if we think of it, THC is like the accelerator of a car and CBD the brakes. But this isn't grandma and grandpa's pots. The potency has gone up nearly 10 times from what it used to be many years ago. If we look at the differences between THC and CBD, THC is what gives a high. It increases the risk of psychosis in some people, and that's what's actually tested for by police or in hospitals. While CBD makes people feel a bit more relaxed, chill out, it doesn't cause psychosis, and it's an important component of medical cannabis. An important message for all of us is the higher the THC, the greater the risk. So THC is what there'll be a lot of warning about with cannabis legalized. There are many types of cannabis, and we think of it just like saying human being. They could be the young, the old, or saying weather. It doesn't tell us a lot about it, or an instrument or an animal. And same thing with cannabis, or if we look at the example of balls there. it's not enough to just say cannabis, but to know a lot more about what it contains. And that's where we'll go into a bit more detail soon. Cannabis has an effect on health. And the main bit would be that a lot of people, actually, it doesn't improve their health, but quite a number of people use it for anxiety, and that's really common amongst young people. We know cannabis can be quite harmful in pregnancy, can affect birth weight, and passes on from mother to baby in breast milk. It also affects our lungs, and if we smoke cannabis frequently and heavily, it can cause lung disease, and none of us want that while we're so young or ever in life. Cannabis is used at a time for young people, which is really, really sensitive because it's a time of the developing brain, and the brain continues to develop up to around the age of 25. Now, this is important because these are important years for education, for relationships, learning, memory, and that's just so important to be aware that the brain continues to develop, and all of you in class still have developing brains. In fact, although the legal age is between 18 and 19, depending on the province, your brains will still be developing. And if you're of legal age, to be aware that you can still be at risk of harms from using it frequently and heavily. This is a study in Canada. And actually, the higher the grade in school, the higher the grade and quantity of cannabis use. And this is quite a scary curve because about grade 7, 2%. But then by grade 12, about 37, nearly 40% of people may be using cannabis in school. So what does it look like? No, it's not just the joints. It comes in waxes, it comes in material called shatter, it comes in, it can be infused and so on, in liquid form and in edibles, gummy bears and so on. So it's not all just rolled up and smoked. Young people use cannabis in many different ways, through a bong, through joints, edibles, vaporized, and drinking, to mention a few. So the impact on education. I'd really like to stress that cannabis affects memory and attention. It really gets in the way of learning in school. And just the times when you just really want to be your best in class, it can cloud things. There's some suggestion that up to 16% of young people in Canada use cannabis just before school or while in school. That'll be a concern for their learning. On mental health. Now, cannabis worsens mental health, particularly in young people with developing brains, as mentioned earlier. And I'll make reference to this with an example. I mean, you can look at these slides later on for more detail. But if we think of what is psychosis, so psychosis, people may have hallucinations, you're hearing voices without being able to make out, or sounds without being able to make out where they're coming from. Seeing things that no one else sees, which can be extremely scary. Feeling touch sensations that no one else can feel. Experiencing smells that no one else can smell. Or taste without a source of the taste that experience. And also having confused or paranoid thoughts, which are no fun. Psychosis is absolutely no fun in young people, and I work with young people with distressing experiences. Cannabis is addictive, and about 1 in 6 of young people around your age, if they start young, will become addicted to cannabis. And that's a problem, and we'll talk about that with the questions and answers. Driving, people may say, oh, but weed doesn't cause death. But driving can be impaired. It increases the risk of accidents, attention and concentration isn't as good, judgment is impaired, impaired alertness, and with alcohol or other drugs, it makes people very dangerous on the road. You surely don't want to lose your license within the first weeks of getting it. So there's a lot more science about cannabis, and these we'll probably be able to discuss further on, but when it's smoked, it goes into the brain really quickly, and when it's eaten, a lot slower, and that also is part of the difference in the way it works. There's a lot more research being done about cannabis, and I'll probably come back to this later if questions come up about some of the science. The genetics I'll show really quickly. Now, all of us have different genes, and let's imagine these bottles are actually bottles of our genes. So I know they're not genes and they're actually jelly beans, but imagine these are all different. And we all have different genetic composition. Now imagine a person at risk of psychosis or mental health problems. Now you may just happen to have the green genes. And that's why your friends may use cannabis and have no effect, or family members. And the person with a particular genetic composition then is at risk. In this case, the green jelly bean person. Cannabis loves fat. So when it's used, THC goes into fat reserves in the body, including the brain. And that's one of the reasons why it's slowly released and can test positive for such a long time. In class, as I mentioned, good old Charlie Brown had to learn. It really doesn't help with education learning with the developing brain. So these are some of the harms that will be on labels in the next few weeks from Health Canada about harms, breastfeeding, machinery, addiction, psychosis, and in young people. So you'll see a lot more of this around. So just giving a really quick overview, cannabis does have an impact on mental well-being. There's more to it than just the leaf. And if we really dissect it in greater detail, this is the sort of detail you see. And what I hope to do as I take your questions from the group is cover some of these really important aspects of the research and our knowledge of cannabis from now on. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Deji. There's a lot going on in that image there that I think a lot of our students may not have the context for yet, but we do have some questions coming in about highlighting the difference between recreational and therapeutic cannabis. I know you alluded to that already, but the students in Ms. Calder's class at Mville District High School are wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more.
Right. Well, medicinal use of cannabis is for evidence-based disorders that may be associated, that may benefit from cannabis. Now, although there have been many, many claims made, the areas that there's stronger evidence would be, for instance, to do with managing vomiting in chemotherapy and cancer, in some very specific types of seizure or epilepsy. Cannabis may also be used. There are many claims about it helping mental health and so on, but these aren't evidence-based and a lot more research will need to be done. Recreational use, again, the main components of both recreational and medicinal use are actually mainly THC and CBD. And regardless of whether it's described as medicinal or recreational, the main component is THC and CBD. CBD has way more medical benefits than THC, and that's the component that's used for medical cannabis or medical marijuana.
Right. And so that brings me right to a question from Mr. Turgonski's class, wondering what happens if you consume cannabis that is made of purely THC or CBD?
Well, if it's made of purely, because cannabis, and the secret to understanding cannabis is the numbers, the ratios. So if it's got 30% THC and 10% CBD, that's a ratio 3:1. And if you think of it, as I said earlier, imagine cannabis like the THC is like the accelerator of the car, CBD the brakes. Now, if it's still 30% with 1% CBD, that's ratio 30:1. And if it's still 30% with 0.1%, that's ratio 300:1. So imagine a car with normal brakes, then imagine the same car with motorbike brakes, and then the same car with bicycle brakes. So the ratio between THC and CBD really determines the way it behaves. If it's full THC, THC increases dopamine in the brain. Does that matter? Yes, it does, because excessive levels of dopamine cause psychosis. And if we just keep that in mind, dopamine, that's not that difficult to remember. And when the brain transmits the neurochemical dopamine, and I've got a few, let's imagine this is dopamine.
Can we hit the stop share button on your screen there, and then we'll be able to see what you're holding up a little bit more easily.
Thank you.
Perfect, thank you.
Great. So if we imagine that these are dopamine balls being transmitted by the nerves, one after the other. Now, with strong, high-potency THC, we may generate way more dopamine than the nerve ending can handle. And that's what happens. So I'll have an imaginary scenario, and you may find this a bit funny, but if there's way more dopamine than the nerve endings can handle, maybe normally handling 2 or 3, it could be a whole rush with the THC, something like this.
Okay, you're right. I laughed. I did.
And that moment when there's way more than the brain nerve endings can handle would be psychosis. And that's when the hallucinations and odd experiences happen. CBD does not have that effect. It does not increase the risk of harms the way we know them, and is not psychoactive.
Right. So what has the medical community proven so far in studies in terms of the effects that CBD has that perhaps makes it desirable as a mode of treatment?
Yes. Well, CBD works more in areas of the brain or the body dealing with inflammation and areas to do with pain and so on. And it's actually those characteristics that have been beneficial. One of the slides, so CBD works more on CB2 receptors, and they're more in the body, while THC works on CB1 receptors, which are more in the brain. So it's these specific differences. As I said, there's no single cannabis. It's these differences that really give the unique characteristics.
Right. And I imagine we'll be seeing a lot more research in coming years as well.
Well, that's exciting because some of the young people in the room may even get Nobel Awards for the research cracking this and understanding. We're just at the beginning of understanding with legalization.
Right. So next I have a question from Ms. Sampson's class, wondering what makes cannabis addictive?
Well, some of the things that make it addictive is from a physical addiction point of view, the body gets accustomed to it and as part of a neurochemical in the body, particularly with people with different genetic makeup. So some of us will become physically more dependent on it. But also, it can become addictive psychologically. So if I'm anxious and I use weed to deal with my anxiety, every time I become anxious, I use it, and it becomes a learned behavior as well. So there's a physical and psychological dependence or addiction to cannabis. And there are a lot of young people who use it to manage anxiety, and gradually addiction follows.
And have you seen any effectiveness in that use? I have heard the hearsay that it's actually counterproductive for anxiety.
Yes, the bit that actually becomes way more counterproductive is the THC component, because that can actually worsen anxiety. It can worsen social anxiety. It can make a person feel paranoid. And some people also have other experiences like greening out, which is the cyclical vomiting with cannabis use. So invariably, cannabis use, particularly the THC component, worsens anxiety rather than improves it.
Right. And next, I'd like to go to a question from Ms. Brown's science class in Hazelton from northern BC. They're wondering, what are some long-term effects of using cannabis at a young age?
Well, one of the more important or most important long-term effects is the risk of developing long-term psychotic illness. So an experience, and I simplified it with the dope balls, an experience whereby the person loses touch with reality continuously for a long time. For most people, they'll get stoned and the effect will wear off. But some people the effect remains and they have a long-term mental health problem, which is what I deal with every day in my work. Some people have worsening of anxiety as well. And for a lot of people, it destroys memory. And that's difficult because imagine even as a young person, you go on a date, you exchange numbers, you just can't even remember the number. Or you're sitting in class and the teacher asks a question and you just can't recall what you've been studying. So impaired memory, the risk of psychosis in the developing brain, it's a key period, is something we should take seriously. Quite different when people are older, but the developing brain is very important. Well, all brains are.
And we've got a question here from Mr. Harbour's class, wondering a prediction from you. How do you predict it will be regulated in the foods that we eat? So at restaurants and other places.
Well, with foods, that's going to be extremely tricky. And what Health Canada has wisely done is not licensed edibles straight away. So that'll be in a year's time from now. As I mentioned earlier in one of the slides, with food, edibles, it goes straight, smoked, it goes straight to the brain. But edibles can take up to half an hour or 2 hours before the effect kicks in. So if I were to use cannabis just before class, the effect will show straight away while in my first lecture. If I were to take edibles, it may be the second or third lecture, or even the fourth, where the effect will start kicking in. So regulating in Health Canada will need to ensure there's very tight regulation with food products because it can be infused into foods and gummy bears and cookies and so on. This is going to be very, very tricky territory. And the rule is if you're ever going to consume edibles, start very low, go very slow.
And what is the current medical recommendations in light of the decriminalization that we're expecting in 2 weeks today? So what is the medical community advising at this point?
Well, the advice for young people is, number one advice, we discourage use. Although some people, in fact, some in the audience may be using it for medical reasons, and that's prescribed. But the advice is, with a developing brain, we're encouraging you not to use cannabis or weed yet. If you do use, and we do understand that we must reduce harms, that not to use high potency weed and rather low THC weed. So if the weed has more THC percentage than your age, you begin to look for trouble. So use lower potency weed, more of a CBD content, but way, way lower THC content, although still discouraging use. Do not drive with it. Do not mix with other drugs as well. So the warnings are for young people, be careful. There are risks of harms.
Right. And we did talk about some long-term harms already, so there's definitely some more awareness today on that. Next, I would like to go to a question from Ms. Gauthier's class, wondering what is more common in Canada, medical use or recreational use?
The way things are going, we're going more into, and recreational use will change within the next few weeks because the research is people who say they use it. And we don't know for certain. So those with medical have them approved. They're not prescriptions because doctors don't prescribe medical, they can approve. So people get a supply. While recreational use continues to go up. It depends on what group we're measuring as well. As I said earlier, grade 7 is about 2%, while by grade 12, about 37, 38%. So the numbers we have now are just as good as today. The next few weeks and months will tell us a lot more. But in the younger group, the larger proportion used is recreational. In older people, in particular groups, they use medical.
Right. And Mr. Harbour's class is another question here, this time about secondhand smoke. Is it possible for someone to get a high or have any of these effects from secondhand cannabis smoke?
Yes, it is. The answer is yes, yes, yes. If you sit next to someone smoking, and you're probably watching a movie together on Netflix, and you're not, you sat there watching the movie together for 2 hours, you're also inhaling. If the windows aren't open and it's in an enclosed space, possibly in a basement, you could inhale enough to also test positive for cannabis. So the advice would be, if you're not into using it, let the other person know that you'd rather they didn't smoke around you. And certainly if you are in the space, make sure it's ventilated, windows open.
That sounds very similar to tobacco smoke then.
Very much so, yes.
Right.
And
now I have a question from Mr. Stahl's class to Ian Bazalgett in Calgary, wondering, are there age limits with the legalization in Canada? And I was wondering if they vary from province to province, if you know.
Yes, there are age limits. The general recommendation is not below the age of 18, but to the best of my knowledge, most provinces, bar two, have gone for the age of 19. So there are age limits. And as I said earlier, even though those are the age limits, so in Ontario, it'll be 19, the brain still has a number of years to develop. So if I determine, I'm 18 or 19 now I can use it frequently daily, I can still have the harms to the developing brain, because this is the classroom of developing brains. I don't know how clear it is. And this is the brain more mature. And it's actually just giving the brain a chance to be the best brain it can be, because you can need it till the end.
And now an interesting question from Ms. Sampson's class, wondering, why do people still use cannabis despite knowing the consequences?
Well, people use quite a number of psychoactive substances or substances that may be mind altering. So people use alcohol, and alcohol has a lot of harms, but people find it helps them either relax or makes them feel good about themselves. I guess people make similar judgments when it comes to cannabis as well. And the guidance then is, if anyone's going to make a decision to use any substance that may have the potential for harms, to make sure it's used safely. And to do that, equipped with knowledge and the facts. There's a lot of dubious information online, and I'll suggest, if you want credible information, probably start with Health Canada websites, because that's verified. And look at some of the links there.
Yes, I did see on canada.ca that the federal governing body has put out some information already that is fairly easy to browse through depending on the details you're looking for. So I'll make sure in the follow-up email that all of our webinar attendees receive that I'll include that link for you. So if you're looking for more information, that is a good place to start. And an interesting question I'd like to squeeze in here from Miss Etmansky's class, wondering if cannabis can be hidden in Halloween candy or perhaps any food, and how can you tell the difference? How can you know if it has cannabis in it or not?
Well, the answer to that is yes. Cannabis oils and cannabis products can be infused into most foods. Will it be easy to detect? No. And I think we're moving into a completely different realm of what we consume and harms. So cannabis, if decided, can actually be added to punch and so on. So I'd say caution, be very careful what you consume, be thoughtful about it. And if you feel a bit funny or odd, stop. A common mistake with people with edibles is they expect to be high and no effect happens in the first, then they say, oh, this isn't working, and they have more and more and more. And then a torpedo just launches and then they become really unwell. While with smoke, it's straight away. So edibles start extremely low, go extremely slow.
That makes a lot of sense given that delayed reaction. Yes. And if, I guess there's always some concern with any open food, especially Halloween candy. I know we talk to our youth about not consuming anything that has been obviously tampered with or doesn't have a wrapper and doesn't come from someone trusted. so if something is a wrapped, purchased edible product, do you know if there will be any identification that it includes cannabis, or maybe identification of the levels of THC and CBD, or is all of that still being figured out over the next year?
Yes, well, edible products are not legal yet, so consumption actually will still be illegal. But when they are made legal, they will be very carefully labeled. And the logo you saw with the red THC will be THC and CBD levels of the content of all cannabis products in in Canada. I nearly said UK there. In Canada, will be labeled, and that really helps just to know what proportion. So it's not random. You think you're buying, a poodle, and you get a pug, or, well, I'm not biased towards those dogs, but just helps you know precisely what you're buying and make informed decisions, just like alcohol.
Right. So we are running out of time here. I do want to finish off with this question from Mr. Turgonski's class. 2 questions. 1, what are you most concerned about in the coming weeks and months? And what are you excited about?
I'm more concerned about people who do not have experience in using cannabis and may feel, oh, this is a time to just try as much as I can without being informed. So I'm concerned that people will, in haste, consume large quantities, put themselves at risk of intoxication, may end up in emergency rooms or end up with psychotic symptoms, as I explained earlier. And that would be a worry. So that'll be my greatest immediate concern. What I'll be excited about is the potential to do incredibly more research, and for Canada to lead the world in cannabis-related research, both medicinal and understanding the genetics, risks of harms, and so on. So that's exciting, all within a legal, informed framework.
Right. And do you have anything else, any parting words that you'd like to share with our students before we wrap up today?
Well, my parting words will be, for many of us, we have, as young people, there are all sorts of emotions, ranging from, anger to happiness, love, and so on. And that cannabis and drugs do not actually enhance these emotions. And for anxiety, I do encourage all of you through school activities to learn other ways of actually dealing with anxiety and understanding how to live happy, healthy lives without it being defined by the use of a drug. Anxiety would be an important one for me, and the risk of psychosis that may follow. But good luck, it's around the corner. And whatever you do, make sure you see through the smoke wisely.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all the factual information and the experience you were able to share with us today. I did post that hyperlink at canada.ca with the information on cannabis from Health Canada. So that is in the chat if you wanted to click on that. I'll wait a few extra seconds here before I close down the webinar so that you have a chance to click on that. And if you're watching this video on YouTube, just scroll down into the description. It will be included there as well. So thank you so much to Dr. Oyedeji Ayonrinde. Thanks so much for your expertise today and for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and stay safe, guys.
And to those who joined us as viewers today, thank you so much for joining us and for submitting such great questions. You can join us again for more PIR live events in the future, including lab tours, demonstrations, and other topics ranging all over the map. And more information on this and our other educational programs are available at pirweb.org. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.